Rioso, and welcome back to the Welsh History Podcast, episode 233, The Politics of Educational Change. The early 19th century was characterized by a patchwork of systems of education, largely controlled by religious institutions and charities, as well as, one could argue, industrial corporations who also wanted to see education brought to at least to a degree to children. The government first made efforts to support education with the creation of the Committee of Councils on Education in 1839, which began administering grants to schools. However, deeper state involvement in education was considered to be controversial at the time, and it was a debate within the political atmosphere of the UK. In the midst of this was a changing of political power in the UK, something that we have brushed aside a little bit as we've been talking through education so far in the previous two episodes. But it's key in understanding why there is a change to government intervention in the policies that are going on within education, how the government becomes more and more involved. In 1843, Sir James Graham, the Home Secretary, proposed an education bill which sought to allocate government funds to Anglican schools and place education under church oversight. This bill faced strong opposition from, as you can imagine, nonconformists and secularists who saw it as an attempt to impose Anglican doctrine. Due to widespread resistance, the bill was withdrawn, highlighting the difficulties in forming a consensus on state involvement in education, and, of course, the political interests of the various parties. Another significant step was the 1846 Minutes of Council, which introduced teacher training programs and improved school inspections. Although not formal legislation, these measures enhanced the quality of education and demonstrated a growing governmental role in the schooling. The Liberal Party played a crucial role in pushing for education reform. As advocates for social progress and economic modernization, Liberals saw education as a means to improving individual opportunity and strengthening the workforce. The Liberals were an amalgamation of the Whigs, Radicals, and the Free Trade Tories known as Peelites. We've talked a bit about the Radicals and their influence in democratic reform in the earlier part of this century, and how their overall influence was working. But in the 1850s, in an understanding that they needed to have more levers of power, they united with these other disparate groups. And because of this, they became the chief rivals of the Conservatives in the latter half of the 19th century. The Liberals were much more in favor of democratic reforms and for the working class. We'll get into more depth on the political front in future episodes, but it's important to understand where the Liberals came from to understand why they were pushing forward this agenda of education reform. In 1870, the Elementary Education Act was introduced by the Liberal government. It was considered to be a landmark achievement, emphasizing state involvement in education while maintaining a balance with religious institutions. Liberals championed policies that expanded access to education, particularly for working-class children, as they believed that literacy and knowledge was essential to informed electorates and productive societies. The Tories, on the other hand, were more cautious about state intervention and in education. Historically aligned with the Church of England and the aristocratic interests, they were skeptical of the government-controlled education and in favor of continued role of voluntary and religious schools. They feared that increased state involvement could undermine traditional institutions and reduce the influence of the church. However, as the demand for education grew, even conservative politicians recognized the need for reform, particularly in addressing the inadequacies of existing school provisions. The contrast between the two parties was evident in their approach to funding and control. While the Liberals pushed for greater government oversight and secular school boards, the Conservatives sought to preserve religious education and limit direct state control. These ideological tensions shaped the compromises embedded in the Forester Act and subsequent educational policies. Despite earlier setbacks, pressure for reform continued. Industrialization and urbanization led to an increase in literacy demands, and social reformers pushed for better education as a means to improve living conditions and social mobility, We'll bring examples of these particular social reformers as we talk in further depth about that subject. So for now, we're just going to talk about that very generally so you understand. In the 1860s, the annual funding allocated for schools by Parliament exceeded £800,000. But there was growing pressure for the state to provide schools in areas where none had previously existed. One of the chief stumbling blocks was the vested interest of religious societies. There was conflict of opinion over whether the state should pay for schools to be run by particular religious denominations or whether schools should have no association with any denomination. Matters began to move forward, however, in 1869 when the recently formed National Education League began its campaign for free, compulsory, non-religious education for all children. The views expressed by the industrialists that mass education was vital to the nation's ability to maintain its lead in manufacturing carried considerable weight in Parliament. A bill which met many but not all of the League's wishes was drafted and introduced by W.E. Forster and would pass quickly. As you can tell, name of the bill named after the person who introduced it. The turning point came in the 1870 Elementary Education Act we now mentioned, also known as the Forester Act, confusingly, which because it was, of course, introduced by Liberal MP William Forster. This act marked the first major step forward towards compulsory education. It established school boards to oversee primary education and ensured access for children in areas without sufficient schools. The act, however, reflected political compromises. It did not make education fully compulsory, leaving attendance largely voluntary. Moreover, it continued to allow denominational schools to operate, appeasing religious groups that had long resisted state intervention. The school boards and elected ratepayers had the authority to build and manage schools where existing provisions were inadequate and ensured a broader reach of education. Following the Forester Act, further reforms sought to refine and expand on the educational provisions. In 1872, Scottish Educational Act applied similar principles to Scotland, creating a framework for universal schooling. Unlike England, Scotland adopted compulsory attendance from the outset, setting a precedent for future legislation in the rest of the United Kingdom. The 1873 Elementary Education Act made administration adjustments, improving the efficiency of school boards and increasing funding to expanding access to education. By 1875, the Artisan and Labor Dwelling Improvement Act indirectly supported educational reforms by improving living conditions for working-class families, thereby enabling more children to attend school regularly without the burden of severe poverty. By 1875, education in the UK had undergone a dramatic transformation. While it was not yet fully compulsory, these legislative changes laid the groundwork for future reforms that would eventually make education a right for all children, regardless of class and background. So how did this affect Wales? Because, of course, this is a Welsh history podcast. It's kind of important to cover that aspect of it as well, right? From a political standpoint, there was no separation of the British government in England or what we perceive as being the boundaries of Wales. This would obviously mean that education in Wales was deeply affected by the reforms introduced in this period, though it faced unique challenges. I mentioned previously how things changed in Wales and for the Welsh language due to the pressure on the language and those who advocated for and against it. In 1861, through the revised code, government payments to schools were replaced by a fee grant of 12 shillings per child per year. However, 2/3 of the money could be withheld if pupils failed to satisfy the inspector's annual examinations. Students had to show that they were making progress in arithmetic and reading and writing of English. The new code did not prohibit the use of Welsh, but as the livelihood of teachers depended to a large extent upon whether or not pupils could at least have a mechanical knowledge of English, they had a financial interest in boycotting the Welsh language. The previously mentioned 1870 Forester Act applied to Wales as well, introducing school boards and expanding access to education. However, many of these schools promoted English language instruction only and reinforced the dominance of English over Welsh in formal education. The payment by results system we discussed last episode and mentioned previously was retained, and the completed network of schools provided education which was almost entirely in English. As historian Janet Davies put it, quote, "The Education Act of 1870 was widely considered to be one of the most grievous blows ever suffered by the Welsh language. Its impact has been exaggerated. It did not suddenly impose a system of English medium education," end quote. We have seen over the past year that the English language, which has been common for some aspects of life in the Southeast for a long time, has been spreading farther and farther into the Welsh homeland. From the borders to the remnants of the old principality, few could deny it would increase as pupils returned home speaking only English at school. But this was not new, and it was not rare even a century previous. Speaking of English had become the dominant language for the upwardly mobile. It became the key ingredient to achieving financial success. So you can't say that it wasn't a problem even at that point. As Dr. Davies noted, quote, "The practice of teaching Welsh-speaking children in English goes back to the 17th century. In those areas where the language was already weak, compulsory education through the medium of English probably proved the final blow. But where there were so many factors at work that it would be naive to consider the language used in schooling to be the sole determinant of linguistic change," end quote. So in other words, of course, it wasn't the only reason why English was becoming the predominant language. It wasn't the only reason why people were teaching that their children needed to learn English in order to make their way in society. This is something that had been going on for a while. As has been the case for the aristocracy of the 16th century and the middle class and industrialists of the early 19th, the link between personal advancement and English was powerfully reinforced by the spread of English medium education, not only at the elementary but also at the intermediate and higher levels. In order to get ahead, you needed English. Welsh was no longer the language of the regular people, and it was the language of those who were looking backward against the headwinds of progress, at least if you were a Victorian. That's the translation in the mindset of the Victorian educators. The Welsh was now the language of the Hicks, quote, and the uneducated. Also, not my words, but more or less the idea. Yet, it still fought against all this change, and it survived it. Anglicanization, in other words, becoming more and more English, can be seen most strongly in the politics of the period, where the growing influence of the Liberal Party aligned with the interests of nonconformists in promoting accessible and non-sectarian education. The Liberal Party might be the champions of poorer working classes, but it was an English-speaking class. So, what changed? Why was it that Welsh scrambled against this pressure, and what focused and forced its survival in the face of this possible extinction? Keep in mind that at the same time, Irish, Gaelic, as it's sometimes called, or just purely Irish, as well as Scottish Gaelic and Cornish, which had been literally extinct for 1,000 years almost at this point, had been under the same pressure and had started at times to crumble. All three of these will make a revival, but why is it that English did not overtake Welsh in the face of nearly 1,000 years of pressure from English language domination? While some might focus on the negative, I think it's important to remember that we are seeing a rise of Welsh nationalism in this period. This Celtic revival, as it gets called, meant that people were sensitive to issues like this and the problems that were being faced by the day-to-day activities of government and the administration of language. By the late 19th century, many of these same people were becoming quite concerned that Welsh speakers were being taught in only English and they were losing the language. Some began to question why this was seen as the best solution in Wales. Chief among them was Dan Isaac Davies, an inspector of schools in Glamorgan. At the National Eisteddfod at Aberdare in 1885, he established the Society for the Utilization of Welsh in Education. A bit of a mouthful, but then it receives an even more ironic addition when the subtitle is added, "For the better teaching of English," end quote. The reason for adding this was to allay the suspicions of authorities that this was a rebellious ideal of pushing Welsh language, ironically. For Davies and his fellow proponents, undoubtedly, this had been out of a serious concern for the well-being of the Welsh language. Yet they were also aware how English language educators and authority figures might perceive this ideal and thus tried to put little ways of getting around that. They would change eventually to its more well-known title of the Welsh Language Society, or Cymdeithas Sastriaeth Gymraeg. In 1885, Davies published a collection of his articles, Ter Milwyn o Gymru Daethlwag, the 3 million bilingual Welsh people, in which he foresaw that, given an enlightened educational policy, Wales would have 3 million bilingual citizens by 1985. It was, as you can imagine, a hopeful document. He was largely responsible for the memorandum on the use of Welsh submitted to the Royal Commission on Elementary Education in 1886. Shortly before his untimely death, he gave evidence before the commission. On the basis of the Royal Commission's report, capitalization grants were made to schools which taught Welsh, and the use of bilingual books was authorized, and the teaching of geography and history of Wales was encouraged. The concession made in 1890 was at best a small sample, and it did not raise Welsh from its lethargic state to a degree that Davies had hoped. The reason was simple. Under the 1890 concession, no school was obliged to use Welsh. Where it was used, it was grafted upon by an English curriculum. To use a Canadian example, which is the one I can most easily provide, this is a country where bilingualism is considered to be a fact. We have both French and English as our main languages. However, the reality of the situation is that English is the majority of most of the population, and there is a smaller minority of French speakers. And in that grouping, there are predominantly only French speakers, then some bilingual speakers, and then even within those French language enclaves, there are still English-only speakers. And it's always been a debate on how to deal with this. In the 1960s and 70s, they moved towards bilingualism, the idea that we would have French and English being used as the two founding languages of what we call Canada. You can have a debate about whether it's the founding language of the area. That's a whole nother discussion, but that was the discussion at the time. And so, therefore, it was made as a part of education that you would take French. It wasn't mandatory, which is the first problem, necessarily. But as a young child, I learned French at school for 2 years of elementary education. As I moved up into intermediate and then higher education, I no longer took French, and my knowledge of French evaporated at that point. I still mostly remember French from actually watching television than I ever did from my education at school. Thus, you don't have a proper comparison. And if you look at Welsh in schools where it's only taught as an elective, that would be a very similar situation. If you're not using it outside of school and you're not using it outside of one class, it's very hard to learn the language. In some areas, however, there is what is known as French immersion, and these are schools in which most of the education is taught in French, and it's taught to particularly people who don't necessarily speak French as their first language. 2 of my children entered into immersion schools, and I know for a fact that in Wales now this is the case. There are schools where Welsh is the only medium where things are taught, and that does make a major difference. These children, my 2 youngest, actually speak considerably more French than I ever even forgot, and in all fairness to them, they deal with coming home to a predominantly English language home. Most of their friends only speak English, and most of everything outside of the classroom was in English. And because of that, they haven't taken it forward necessarily beyond that point, because for them, that didn't ever really set in the same. Now, does that mean it's a failure? No, it just means that they did pick up French. They still understand it. They can still speak it. They can still read it, which is much more than I could have done. And so from that, I would argue is much more successful. And I think that's the same way with Welsh, in that if you set it up as a predominantly elective course, of course, people are going to not take the language. They're not going to perceive it as being important enough to take and continue to study and to continue to grow. That's the reason why the 1890 concession fails for the most part. But what it does do and how it works for the world in keeping Welsh alive is it does allow some people to take Welsh and actually continue to learn in the medium of Welsh. It also allows teachers who decide to use Welsh the ability to do so without punishment. Certainly, there's still a degree of punishment in a financial stipend sense, but if you, say, live in an area where predominantly it is Welsh speakers, it's going to be easier for you, at least in the short run, to begin teaching in Welsh, and that will help teaching overall, and maybe you divert into English as the secondary language for a while, and then it merges into the primary language. That sort of ideal might seem great, but it still accomplishes the same goal, which is that people walking out of education are learning in English. And so they are going on and continuing in English. And you see that today in the way that the Welsh population who do not speak Welsh sometimes deal with the Welsh language. Not every one of them, certainly not all of them, but there is a perception amongst at least some of them that the second language, as it's sometimes perceived, the Welsh language, gets in the way of things and that it gets special privileges, almost the opposite of what we saw in this period, where it was like the afterthought of a language. And so all of these things go on in Wales as they do in Canada, to be fair, because we have the exact same issues about French. There's a lot of debates, I know for a fact, amongst friends of mine in the past and even amongst political officials about the use of French on our merchandise that we buy, because no matter what you buy, it's going to have labels in English and French. It's mandatory. It's part of what we have to do in order to meet the legislation that we have. As an example, for those of you watching on the video, I have a biscuit or a cookie box, depending on how you want to describe it. And you can see on that it says celebration, which is in English, but I mean, it's also a French word, so that doesn't really clarify anything. And then it says chocolat noir, or dark chocolate. And then down here it says same thing, and it's in French. But if you flip it over, you get the English language version, butter, cookies, dark chocolate. And that's the way the labeling works in Canada. And so you have both. And that's something they don't have in Wales as of yet, not to the same degree, because everything is labeled that way in Canada. But nonetheless, that is one of the ways that we've done to try and fight the degradation of a language. And it's a way to combat these problems. And it leads to massive debates in my country, let alone in Wales, over how far that should go. And I think that's a discussion that we will have going forward as we move into the 1900s and we start to see the rise of outfit of like Plaid Company, who will start to argue about the use of Welsh and the ideal of a Welsh nation in much more detail, and becomes much more prominent to this whole argument. But from an educational standpoint, this is where we leave the Welsh language for now, and we'll get much more into it as we go into the 1900s and we start to discuss about this debate about the use of Welsh in schools and how there is a change in the way people start to look at it, and how the language and starts to become important, not just to those at a certain area of the country, not just those in a certain economic dynamic, but actually to people who are in higher education and the consequences of that, and how it starts to drive a sentiment about trying to have Welsh be the predominant language, and how it starts to force people to reevaluate that. And you can go into all the various conflicts that go about because of that. But with all that said and done, we're probably done for today. And I would like to thank you all for watching and listening today. I very much appreciate your input, and I hope to hear from you as well. As I said on the last freeform episode, I hope you consider contacting me if you have questions, comments, or concerns. You can always reach me at the Welsh History Podcast at gmail.com. You can reach out to me at Blue Sky, Twitter, or Instagram at Welsh History Pod, or you can also reach me on Facebook.com/Welsh History Podcast. And again, if you would like to help with the funding of this podcast through some of the loftier goals I have, you can do so through patreon.com/Welsh history. Thank you, everybody. Have a great day. Enjoy. Take care. Bye-bye. Welsh History Podcasts is a member of the Evergreen Podcast Network. To find more information on them, you can do so at evergreenpodcasts.com. Thanks for listening.